The year was 1919. The Great War had just ended, the Spanish flu was raging across the globe, and the United States was holding its breath, teetering on the edge of the roaring 20s. In Boston, Massachusetts, the air in the North End neighborhood, a bustling, densely populated area of immigrant families, cramped tenements, and salty seaside commerce, was usually thick with the smell of fish, coal smoke, and fermenting beer. But on the afternoon of January 15th, a far stranger, sweeter, and ultimately more deadly aroma began to permeate the frigid air. This was not the scent of a bakery. It was the smell of molasses, the thick, dark byproduct of refining sugarcane, essential for making industrial alcohol, rum, and flavoring for thousands of common goods. The source of this impending catastrophe was a massive 50-foot-tall steel storage tank owned by the Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of U.S. Industrial Alcohol. This behemoth stood directly on the waterfront near Keeney Square, an imposing, rust-colored giant looming over the nearby elevated train tracks and the tightly packed streets where workers and families lived and played. It held over 2.3 million gallons of crude, unfermented molasses, destined to be shipped north to Cambridge, where it would be converted into the industrial alcohol needed for manufacturing munitions for the post-war boom. For months, locals had complained. They reported strange groans, creaks, and loud popping noises emanating from the tank. Children swore they could see fissures on its riveted seams, weeping dark brown tears. The molasses inside, stored in the unusually warm stretch of weather leading up to January, had begun to ferment slightly, producing a small but significant buildup of carbon dioxide gas, increasing the internal pressure. The company's response to these frantic, repeated warnings from neighborhood residents? Dismissal. USIA executives, focused on maximizing production and profits, had rushed the construction of the tank in 1915, cutting corners on inspection and structural integrity. A cursory inspection had been performed, but it was so poorly executed that the inspector, reportedly under the influence of alcohol, signed off on it without truly checking the weak welds and thin steel plating. The tank was, in short, a ticking bomb of sugary sludge. At approximately 12:30 p.m. on that fateful Wednesday, the inevitable happened. With a deafening roar that one survivor later described as a machine gun firing a continuous belt of ammunition, the tank ruptured. The failure was instantaneous and catastrophic. The immense hydrostatic pressure of the molasses, combined with the internal fermentation pressure, blasted the steel plates outward. What followed was not a gentle spill, but a literal wave, a tsunami of viscous, dark brown death, estimated by engineers to be 25 feet high at its origin, surging through the streets at an estimated 35 miles per hour. The sheer kinetic energy of this sticky mass was unbelievable. It did not flow, it smashed. The wave slammed into the elevated railway supports, buckling the steel structure and sending a passenger train crashing to the street below. Buildings near the harbor were simply washed away, their foundations undermined by the force of the liquid. The shock wave alone was strong enough to shatter windows blocks away. In the narrow streets of the North End, residents had no chance. Firefighters, police, and dock workers were caught entirely off guard. Horses pulling wagons were swept off their feet and drowned in the muck. People who were standing on the sidewalks were lifted and hurled against buildings. The molasses, thick and cold, trapped its victims. It wasn't like water, which you could swim through. It was a dense, clinging medium that suffocated instantly. Survivors who managed to stay afloat found themselves stuck, struggling against a powerful, sticky current that pulled them under. The scene immediately following the disaster was one of surreal horror. The streets of a major American city were transformed into a grotesque, sticky riverbed. The freezing January air caused the molasses to cool rapidly, increasing its viscosity and trapping victims even more firmly. Rescuers, policemen, sailors, and hastily summoned soldiers from the nearby USS Nantucket waded through waist-deep goo trying to pull bodies free. The rescue effort was agonizingly slow. Dragging a victim out of the molasses was like trying to pull them from quicksand, except the sand was a semi-edible, tar-like substance that coated everything. By the time the immediate surge subsided, the damage was done. 21 people were killed, ranging from a 10-year-old boy crushed by the collapsing train to Italian immigrants running shops to elderly residents in their homes. Over 150 others were injured, suffering broken bones, internal injuries from being slammed by debris, or lung damage from inhaling the thick syrup mixed with the coal smoke and frigid air. The cleanup was arguably as astonishing as the disaster. The molasses had seeped into cellars, coated the trolley tracks, and filled the basements of the north end. It took weeks under the glare of intense national scrutiny for cleanup crews to remove the bulk of it. Salt water from the harbor was pumped in, which, ironically, only made the molasses expand and turn into a lighter, stickier foam that coated the city for months. The entire area smelled sickeningly sweet well into the spring and summer. The true lasting impact, however, was not the sweetness, but the lawsuit. The survivors and the families of the deceased sued U.S. Industrial Alcohol. USIA attempted to argue that the tank had been dynamited by anarchists, a common scapegoat during the era of the first Red Scare. However, the ensuing court case, which lasted for years, was a landmark moment in American jurisprudence. The appointed auditor, Hugh Ogden, spent nearly 3 years meticulously reviewing the evidence. His final report unequivocally found USIA liable, citing poor construction, a lack of proper inspection, and the company's failure to heed warnings. It was one of the first major instances in U.S. history where a corporation was held financially and legally responsible for such a massive, unforeseen industrial accident. The Boston Molasses Flood of 1919 serves as a chilling, sticky reminder of the industrial arrogance of the early 20th century. It was a disaster so bizarre that it sounds like fiction, yet it was brutally real. It forever changed the way structural engineering and corporate accountability were viewed in the United States, proving that even the most mundane, everyday substance, like a simple syrup, can become an instrument of immense, tragic destruction when profit is prioritized over human life. The North End never quite forgot the day the sweet promise of American industry turned into a dark, suffocating wave.